My name is Rachel Miller, and at 34 years old, I had built something no one in my family could have imagined. To the outside world, I was just the overlooked middle child of a powerful Midwestern businessman. To my father, Robert Miller, I was little more than a distraction compared to my two brothers, David and Eric, who had always been groomed to inherit everything. This Christmas was the first time in almost a decade that I'd set foot inside my childhood home, a sprawling colonial estate in Indianapolis, where the chandeliers gleamed but the love had always been scarce. My stomach twisted as I walked toward the front door. I wasn't just bracing for awkward small talk. I was bracing for the same cold dismissal that had followed me since childhood. Dinner began with all the pomp you would expect. Crystal glasses, my father at the head of the table, my brothers basking in his praise. Then came the announcement. With his fork tapping the rim of his wine glass, my father declared, "Rachel, you will not be part of my inheritance. Your brothers have earned it. You chose your own path." The words sliced through me, but I didn't flinch, because what none of them knew, what no one at that table suspected, was that my name had been printed that very morning on a list that would change the entire balance of power in this family forever. Stay with me, because what happened next turned a Christmas dinner into a reckoning no one saw coming. And before I go on, if stories of family revenge hit close to home, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment. I promise, this one will leave you breathless. On Maple Crest Drive, the Millers were the family that made the neighborhood talk. The house was brick and bright with manicure hedges that smelled faintly of boxwood after rain. From the sidewalk, everything looked plentiful and orderly, the way my father liked it. All the real mess lived indoors, where order met hierarchy and hierarchy meant I learned early how to make myself smaller. My father, Robert Miller, built Miller Industrial Systems, a mid-sized manufacturer of warehouse automation parts that supplied plants across the Midwest. Our dinner conversations were little trade shows. Supply chain, margins, win rates. My brothers, David and Eric, soaked it up like they were getting fitted for crowns. I learned where to sit, so I wasn't asked to speak. "Business is a blood sport," Dad would say, tapping the edge of his water glass with a buttery steak knife. "And men have the stomach for it." My mother, Linda, had a way of smoothing napkins the second silence got uncomfortable. She believed in keeping the peace, and the peace looked like my father unchallenged, my brothers praised, and me productive, quiet, agreeable. When I asked too many questions, she'd touch my wrist and whisper, "Rach, not now." I started hearing "not now" as "not you." Most girls remember their first car as a symbol of freedom. I remember mine as a symbol of allocation. On David's 17th birthday, Dad tossed him the keys to a new silver Ford F-150, the kind that glinted like it knew it was loved. A few months later, Eric got a sporty Mustang with a ribbon thick as a boa. My car, 2 years after that, was a hand-me-down Civic that coughed at green lights. "Practical," Dad said, patting the faded hood. "No need to show off, right?" The point wasn't transportation. It was place. Place was literal in our house. Seating charts weren't a joke. Dad at the head. Mom to his right. David to his left. Eric next to Mom. Me between whoever ran out of space and the kitchen doorway, where heat and noise spilled onto my chair. On holidays, the overflow table, the one with mismatched chairs, was mine to manage. I'd fold the paper napkins into careful triangles, like that might count as belonging. School became my alternative map. I love numbers because numbers didn't tell you to smile first. In 8th grade, I snuck into the library before opening hours to use the one computer with a CD-ROM drive, working through a free HTML tutorial printed on peppered sheets from a tech blog. I built a clumsy website for the school play and made the title blank. The science teacher, Mrs. Patel, noticed I kept skipping lunch to tinker. She brought me an old Dell from her garage and said, "If you want to learn, nothing here is off limits." She didn't mean just the machine. At North Central High, David ran varsity track. Eric played point guard, all elbows and swagger. Their Letterman jackets were more common than coats in our foyer. I kept my jacket on the back of my desk chair because the sleeves smelled like printer ink and apple shampoo, my two favorite things that year. When I told Dad I was starting a coding club, he blinked like I'd spoken French. What would you do in a coding club, he asked, skeptical smile in place. Build things, I said. Things that sell. Not yet. Well, there you go. He didn't say stop. He rarely did. He just made his indifference sound like the end of the corridor, and most days, I'd turn around rather than walk into the wall. There are 100 small memories that glue the pattern together. The time I was 13 and asked to shadow the assembly line tour he gave to clients. He told me to help your mother with refreshments and handed me a plate of cheese cubes. The AP Calculus award night where he left halfway through because Eric's game went into overtime. The prom dress I had saved for all spring. Navy chiffon with a neckline my mother called hopeful. That Dad declared distracting and suggested I exchange for something respectable. As if modesty could cash a check. That summer, he posted my brothers at the plant and me in the accounting room, filing vendor statements in chronological stacks. The message was always the same. The center ring is for the boys. You can sweep after. My biggest betrayal in high school was almost comical in its execution. For an entrepreneurship competition, I pitched a student-run courier service that optimized routes using a simple spreadsheet solver I'd learned off a forum. Dad's eyes sharpened for the first time in weeks. Route optimization, he repeated. Interesting. 2 evenings later, I passed the study and saw David and Eric at Dad's desk with my figures up on the screen. It's a family entry, Dad said when I walked in. We'll present it together. Your brothers can handle the speaking. I did the math. They did the microphone. We won second place. The boys got a handshake and a photo with the city councilman. I got a thank you card from the program committee that spelled my name Rachel. It lived on my bulletin board until the corner curled away from the pen. By the time college acceptance season hit, I was already working nights at a frozen yogurt shop to save what I knew I'd need. I had my eye on Carnegie Mellon or the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, places where computer science majors were rumored to sleep under their desks because they were too excited to go home. When the acceptance letters arrived, my hand shook so hard I opened one with a butter knife. Dad studied the financial aid sheets like they were quarterly reports. You'll go to Purdue, he decreed, tapping the in-state option with less than a hint of discussion. Affordable, sensible, and you can commute back for the business on weekends. I want to be in a program that's known for AI, I said, trying to keep the tremble out of my voice. Purdue is strong, but CMU doesn't pay your bills, he said. Your brothers need support for the MBA track. Resources aren't infinite. Mom rinsed a glass she had already washed. Your father just wants what's practical, she whispered when we were alone. You'll excel anywhere, honey. I picked Purdue out of necessity and pride, two fuels that burn hot and mean. That fall, on move-in day, Dad didn't come. He sent David with the truck and a 2-word instruction. Be useful. We unloaded the plastic drawers and my patched laptop with the clover sticker, and I promised myself I'd be so useful nobody could ever call me decorative again. College didn't rescue me. It refined me. If home was hierarchy by ritual, campus was hierarchy by output. I liked those odds. I took every hard class first and learned to write code that didn't apologize for itself. I stopped asking for permission to stay late in the lab. When an algorithms professor posed an open problem after class, I stayed until security blinked the lights at 2 a.m. and came back at 6 to finish. When cafeteria wages failed to stretch between textbooks and internet, I taught middle schoolers Scratch at a community center on Saturdays and fixed dorm printers for $5 a pop. Money is the most honest grader I've ever met. It passes or fails your week without ceremony. Every holiday, I drove the I-65 north back to Indianapolis, inching along in sleet that polished the road into a dare. The house smelled like cinnamon and floor wax. The old seating chart never changed. David and Eric gave updates on new ISO certifications, new supply contracts, the new coffee machine in the executive suite that cost more than my laptop. Dad would rest his hand on the table when they spoke, a gesture that looked like blessing. When I mentioned my machine learning research assistantship, he nodded once and asked if I thought about getting a stable role after graduation, maybe in accounting, since you're so organized. Sometimes the antagonism wasn't words, it was absence. Senior year, I presented a paper at a regional tech conference, my first real audience, my first standing Q&A. Dad promised to come. I pictured him there, arms crossed, The hint of a smile he gave only when something exceeded his estimate. He didn't show. He texted later. Plant crisis. Another time. That spring, I came home for Easter and found a binder labeled Succession Plan on the study credenza. Inside were glossy org charts, revised wills, bullet points about legacy preservation, 10 tabs, 10 iterations of a future with my last name that did not include me. I stood there with my hand on the leather for a long time. Then I put it back exactly as I'd found it, as if precision could keep my grief from spilling. When I graduated, Dad clapped politely on the football field and cut out early to take a call. I posed for photos with Mom, who cried into my hair and told me she was proud in a voice that tried not to tremble. The next day, while David and Eric celebrated a planned expansion, I packed my car with the Civic's trunk bungee corded shut and drove out of the cul-de-sac with a certainty that felt like oxygen. My life would not be built in the rooms where I'd learned to be quiet. I didn't leave with a master plan. I left with habits that turned into one. Show up earlier than the lock clicks. Learn what people don't want to explain. Build what makes the room a little less sure it didn't need you. It would be years before anyone in my family understood what that looked like in practice. In those years, their world kept rotating around shipments and margins and quarterly targets. Mine expanded in increments. A late-night idea that worked, a stranger who said yes, a door that opened without asking whose table I belonged at. Back then, I would have told you the hardest part of being the overlooked child is the dramatics, the cutting remarks, the birthday that turns into a roast. I know now it's the quiet that does the damage. The stories nobody tells about you. The empty chair you keep being placed in. The praise that never lands on your side of the table. That quiet became my workshop. If they weren't going to narrate me, I'd write the narrative myself. And when I finally walked back into that house years later for Christmas, I carried a story they couldn't have imagined. I just hadn't decided yet whether I'd let them read it. The first years after Purdue felt like living inside a furnace. Heat, pressure, and the constant choice between breaking or hardening. I landed in Chicago, where I could see the city skyline through the cracks of my rented studio, the kind of place where the radiator moaned all night and the bathroom light buzzed like an angry fly. My Civic had finally died on I-65, so I took the L train everywhere, clutching my laptop like it was both shield and weapon. My first job wasn't glamorous. I worked at a small logistics startup, 10 people in a co-working space with leaky ceilings. The pay barely covered groceries, but I didn't care. I got to write code that mapped delivery routes in real time, and I learned what it meant to keep a company alive with duct tape and nerve. I worked days at the startup and nights as a barista in a downtown cafe, where I learned to steam milk with one hand while debugging code on my phone with the other. Weekends were for contract gigs, building clunky websites for mom-and-pop shops that couldn't afford a design firm. Every dollar that didn't go to rent went into a savings account I labeled future, like naming it could make it real. Meanwhile, back in Indianapolis, my brothers were earning their stripes. David was promoted to vice president of operations after just 2 years, though the joke was he never actually visited the plant floor. Eric handled client entertainment, which meant golf trips and steak dinners billed as relationship building. At Christmas, I'd hear them boast about expense accounts larger than my entire salary, and Dad would beam like they'd just split the atom. I wanted to scream, but instead I bit my tongue and sharpened my resolve. The sacrifices weren't just financial. I lost friends who didn't understand why I kept disappearing into labs or cafes instead of going out. I let relationships wither because explaining my exhaustion felt heavier than the exhaustion itself. One boyfriend broke up with me over voicemail, saying, "You're married to your laptop. I need someone who has time for me." Maybe he was right. My dates were late-night debugging sessions and investor pitch practice in front of my bathroom mirror. Still, I kept pushing. At 26, I entered a hackathon with nothing but a half-finished algorithm that predicted warehouse bottlenecks. My team disbanded on the first night, but I stayed. 48 hours later, my code won third place and caught the attention of a venture scout. That conversation planted the seed for what would eventually become OptiFlow AI, the company I would later scale into a force that even my father couldn't ignore. But before the growth came more grit. OptiFlow began as me in a borrowed basement office with secondhand servers and 3 interns I paid in pizza. We slept on beanbags, coded until sunrise, and chased every small pilot project we could find. Some weeks, I didn't know if I could cover payroll, so I skipped meals and quietly sold my grandmother's ring to buy one more month of runway. It would have been easier to quit, to call home, admit failure, and accept the stable role my father had dangled like a leash. But I couldn't stomach the thought of walking back into that dining room as proof of his prophecy. So I kept climbing, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. I told myself that one day the ledger would balance, that all the sleepless nights, missed birthdays, and quiet humiliations would mean something. And when the first major hospital chain signed with us, when I saw our software actually cut their supply delays by 30%, I felt a flicker of vindication. Not full, not enough to erase years of being diminished, but enough to know I was building something real. Back in Indianapolis, the family photo albums, filled with ribbon-cutting ceremonies and magazine features of my brothers shaking hands with governors. My name never appeared, but I had learned by then, absence is not the same as defeat. Sometimes, absence is incubation, and I was incubating a storm my family could not yet see. Snow was falling in soft sheets when I pulled into the long circular driveway of my childhood home. The Christmas lights traced the eaves of the brick house like jeweled veins, glowing against the Indiana night. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, I was about to learn just how little had. My heart thudded as I stepped inside, carrying a plain overnight bag, and wearing my most neutral clothes, a wool sweater, dark jeans, boots that had seen too many airport floors. I had dressed to disappear, not to dazzle. The watch on my wrist, a slim Rolex I bought the day OptiFlow crossed its first million in revenue, stayed tucked beneath my sleeve. "Rachel, you made it." My mother, Linda, kissed my cheek and pulled me into the foyer. Her perfume smelled the same, lavender and powder, a time capsule that nearly undid me. The living room was a tableau of wealth and tradition. My father, Robert, sat in his armchair near the fireplace, posture rigid even as age had softened his edges. David stood near him with a glass of scotch, Eric hovering nearby, like an echo. Their wives arranged gifts under the tree. Children sprawled on the rug, glowing blue in the light of their phones. Aunts and uncles cluster in corners, murmuring about travel and politics. Every head turned when I entered, and for a moment I felt 13 again, out of place, scrutinized, disposable. "Rachel." My father gave me the same nod he might offer a passing acquaintance. Not warmth, not disdain, just acknowledgement. "Hi, Dad," I said steady. "Merry Christmas." We ate turkey and potatoes on china older than me. Conversation orbited around David's recent expansion deal and Eric's latest client golf retreat. I asked questions, offered polite comments, even drew a smile from my niece when I complimented her dress. Still, I remained orbiting the table like a satellite no one quite wanted to claim. Then, as dessert plates were being cleared, my father tapped his spoon against his wine glass. The sound cut the room like glass breaking. "I have an announcement." His voice held that commanding timbre that once made me straighten in my seat as a child. Conversations died. Children put down phones. Even the football game on the muted TV seemed to pause. After long discussions with a family attorney, I finalized the succession plan for Miller Industrial Systems. David and Eric straightened like soldiers awaiting medals. David will assume the role of CEO when I retire next year. Eric will become president, handling all client relations and expansion projects. Together, they will safeguard the company's future. Applause broke out. Cheers, clinking glasses, the ritual coronation I'd seen rehearsed my entire life. Then, my father's eyes shifted to me, colder than the snow still falling outside. "As for inheritance," he continued, "Rachel will not be receiving any share of the company or family assets. You chose a different path. And in this family, inheritance is earned through contribution." It was not the decision itself that stunned me. I had long suspected as much. It was the public cruelty of it, announced in front of every relative, as if my erasure required witnesses. The room froze. My mother's face went pale, her hands knotting her napkin. David smirked, just slightly. Eric shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. I inhaled once, slow. Then I nodded. Understood, I said evenly, lifting my fork to finish the last bite of pie. The silence afterward was thick as smoke. Then Aunt Carol, bless her brave soul, muttered, "Robert, was that necessary? On Christmas? Family business is family business," my father said firmly, reclaiming his chair like a throne. "And I will not disguise the truth." The table tried to recover. Conversations stumbled forward about winter travel and school plays, but the energy was fractured. I sat quiet, staring at the flicker of the fireplace, a calmness settling over me like armor. And then the first twist arrived. Not from me, but from the next generation. My nephew Ethan, barely 16, suddenly gasped and blurted out, "Holy crap, Aunt Rachel is on the Forbes list." Every fork paused. Heads whipped toward him. "What are you talking about?" David scoffed. Ethan held up his phone, screen glowing. "Look, they just updated the Forbes top entrepreneurs under 40. Aunt Rachel, founder of OptiFlow AI, net worth $2.7 billion. It's her picture, right here." The room went dead still, like a bomb had detonated in silence. My father barked, "Let me see that." Ethan handed him the phone. Robert squinted at the screen, his face draining of color. His lips parted. "This says you founded the company that was just acquired by Titan Tech. That you're worth." His voice cracked on the number. "Billions?" All eyes fell on me. I lowered my fork, finally meeting his gaze. "Yes," I said simply. "That's correct." The room erupted. Voices overlapped. "How long have you? Why didn't you tell us? Is this real?" My mother clutched my hand like she was afraid I might vanish. My father stared, stricken, as though the ground beneath him had tilted. I should have felt triumphant. And in part I did. But beneath that was something heavier. The recognition that no fortune, no headline, could rewrite the years of silence and dismissal. Still, the power shift was undeniable. For the first time, it was Robert Miller left speechless at his own table. But that wasn't the final blow, because the second twist came moments later, delivered not by me, but by the very attorney my father had trusted. Uncle Jack, who also happened to be Dad's longtime legal advisor, cleared his throat. "Robert, there's something you should know. The succession plan you mentioned tonight, I advised against finalizing it without considering Rachel's company. Titan Tech's acquisition of OptiFlow is likely to disrupt the logistics sector, including Miller Industrial. In fact, Rachel's software may soon replace half the systems you manufacture." Gasps. My father's eyes bulged. Jack continued, "If you truly want to preserve the company, you might consider aligning with Rachel. Otherwise, you may find your legacy obsolete within 5 years." The silence this time was deafening. My brothers' faces flushed crimson. My father's jaw clenched. For once, I didn't rush to fill the void. I let the weight of truth settle where it belonged. Christmas dinner had begun as their stage, but by dessert, it had become my reckoning. The house should have been glowing with holiday warmth. Lights twinkling, children laughing, the smell of cinnamon pie floating from the kitchen. Instead, it felt like the oxygen had been vacuumed out of every room. My father's face was still pale from the Forbes revelation. My brothers whispered frantically to each other like corner politicians, and the rest of the family avoided my eyes as if they were afraid of catching whatever fire I had just unleashed. I sat in the middle of it all, my plate pushed aside, my chest tight. The moment I had dreamed of being acknowledged, proving my worth, was here. And yet, instead of joy, a hollow ache spread through me. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to finally win, to stand taller, to force my father to see me. But in reality, the victory felt like standing on a cliff, looking down at all the years I'd climbed alone, realizing no one had been willing to climb with me. I remember birthdays where my brothers unwrapped watches and sports gear while I smiled over secondhand books. I remember the day I presented my first coding project, only to be told it was cute. I remember calling home after working 3 jobs in Chicago, only to hear my father's voice saying, "Your brothers just closed a deal with Johnson Controls." The ache wasn't about money, it was about absence. Decades of being unseen could not be erased by $1 billion headline. And still, the humiliation stung. Not because I was left out of an inheritance. I didn't need it. But because my father had chosen that Christmas dinner, in front of every relative, to make my exclusion official. He wanted my erasure to be public, stamped into the family record. That was the wound. I excused myself to the bathroom and shut the door, gripping the counter as I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My face was calm, but my eyes betrayed me, red at the rims, brimming with everything I'd swallowed for years. Why wasn't I ever enough? I whispered, my voice breaking. The walls didn't answer. In the silence, I realized I wasn't crying because of what my father said tonight. I was crying for every little Rachel who had been told not now or not you. For the girl who had worked herself raw, just to be noticed. For the young woman who had walked across her college graduation stage with no one in the crowd cheering, just for her. The humiliation wasn't tonight. The humiliation had been my whole childhood. Tonight was just the echo. When I finally rejoined the dining room, conversations had splintered into awkward fragments. My brothers huddled near the fireplace, clearly recalculating their approach. My father sat rigid, staring at the flickering tree lights, his hands trembling slightly, as if holding in words he couldn't shape. My mother caught my eye, her face heavy with sorrow, and mouthed, "I'm sorry," but apologies couldn't rewind the clock. I sat quietly, speaking only when necessary, my voice low, almost detached. Inside, though, emotions ricocheted. Pride battled bitterness. Vindication wrestled with grief. The part of me that wanted to stand on the table and declare, "I did this without any of you," was drowned out by the part that wanted to curl into silence and never step foot in this house again. And yet, through the haze of despair, something else flickered. Resolve. I realized that my father's announcement, his attempt to erase me, had failed. Not because of Forbes, not because of my net worth, but because for the first time, I truly understood. I didn't need his validation. I never had. Still, the hurt was raw, the humiliation sharp. And as I sat at that table surrounded by the people who had once defined my worth, I promised myself this. I would not let their blindness break me again. When dawn broke the next morning, frost glazed the windows of my childhood home. The house was still quiet, the kind of silence that settles after a storm. I had barely slept. The humiliation of the night before kept replaying in my mind, but so did the shift. The way the room had turned when my name appeared on that Forbes list. For years, I had dreamed of revenge, of proving my father wrong so thoroughly that he'd choke on his own pride. And now, fate had delivered me the perfect setup. But revenge, I realized, didn't have to look like shouting or slamming doors. It could be something colder, sharper. At breakfast, the family gathered again, though the air was cautious, almost reverent. My father sat at the head of the table, but the power in his posture was cracked. He poured his coffee with trembling hands. My brothers looked like men walking into a boardroom already knowing they were outmaneuvered. "Rachel," my father finally said, his voice gravelly, "we should talk. About last night." I looked at him evenly. "No, Dad. You made your announcement clear. You don't want me in the inheritance or in the company. I accept that." David leaned forward. "Rachel, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. We've been thinking OptiFlow's technology could actually." I cut him off. "David, stop. Last night you all dismissed me. And then you discovered that the little sister you ignored can buy and sell every asset in this house. That doesn't erase decades of being treated as invisible." The table went silent. My mother's eyes watered, but she said nothing. Then came the twist. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were acquisition documents. Titan Tech isn't the only company interested in OptiFlow. I negotiated a parallel deal, one your lawyer should have warned you about. I let the words sink in. Within 6 months, our AI will be integrated into most logistics chains in the Midwest. Miller Industrial's largest clients have already signed contracts with us. Your market share will drop by 40% before the next fiscal year. Gasps echoed around the table. David's face turned scarlet. Eric stammered, You can't just..." I can, I said flatly. And I have. While you were inheriting, I was innovating. My father gripped the table as if it were the only thing anchoring him. His empire, the legacy he worshipped, was dissolving beneath his hands, and the daughter he dismissed was the one holding the match. But that wasn't all. I stood and drew a breath. I've also established the Miller Women in Tech Fund, seeded with $100 million from my sale. It will fully finance education and startups for women across Indiana. Girls who grow up being told they're less important than their brothers will have a different future. That's the legacy I'm choosing. The reaction was seismic. My cousins clapped softly. Even my nieces looked at me with wide, glowing eyes, as though I'd cracked open a world they hadn't known was possible. My father's lips trembled, not with pride, but with something closer to fear. And in that moment, I understood. The greatest revenge wasn't stripping him of money or power. It was proving that his blindness, his cruelty, his favoritism, had forged someone stronger than he could ever control. David tried once more. Rachel, think about what you're doing. The family name. The family name, I interrupted, means nothing if it's built on erasure. My name, my work, will stand on its own. And unlike you, I don't need Dad's throne to prove my worth. I grabbed my bag, my boots echoing against the hardwood floor. At the door, I paused and looked back one last time. For years, you tried to erase me from this family. But history won't remember the heirs who coasted on Dad's empire. It will remember the woman you underestimated. Then I left. As I drove away down Maple Crest Drive, the snow still falling in soft silence, I felt the weight in my chest begin to lift. Revenge hadn't been loud. It hadn't been theatrical. It had been precise, logical, inevitable. I wasn't the daughter begging for approval anymore. I was the storm they never saw coming. That Christmas was supposed to be another chapter in the long story of my family overlooking me. Instead, it became the night the entire script flipped. My father's empire wasn't destroyed in a single evening, but the illusion of his absolute power was. And more importantly, I walked out of that house, no longer tethered to the need for his approval. I had built something bigger than their inheritance. I had carved out a future defined by my own choices, my own risks, and my own vision. And in doing so, I showed the very family that tried to erase me that silence cannot bury resilience forever. Today, when I think of legacy, I don't see Robert Miller's factory floors. I see the girls who will use my fund to launch futures no one can dismiss. That's my true inheritance, the one no one can take. What about you? What would you have done in my place? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe for more stories like